Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. We are honored to have all of you here, regardless of the weather, condition, and traffic, and so on. This is, of course, the area that you will be hearing about, the Uyghurs of Xinjiang, and the topic is right there, and we have a distinguished professor who is going to be covering it. So let me just, before properly introducing our speaker, who will be really enlightening us on the area and the people and the issues involved, which is not and has not been well covered in the newspaper or TVs, being so involved with Mr. Trump and all his politics. A great people, ancient people, ethnic group have been ignored very badly. We hope you all understand the issues after the discussion, and we hope we do a little more for those people to improve their life, their freedom, and their dignity. Before I introduce our distinguished speaker, let me tell you about two other events that we have, which will be also helpful to attend. The first one is on Friday, May 24th. We will be having speaking on Kyrgyzstan. The speaker will be Christopher Edling, a learned scholar again, and this will cover a part of the area of ex-Soviet area, which was border with this area, Xinjiang, that we will be covering tonight. On Wednesday, June 5th, which the UN has this designated World Environmental Day, we will present an event called Youth Demand Action on Climate Change. And we all need to know a lot more about that subject and how things need to be addressed. And we have a student from age 13 to 20 coming, making presentation, and it will be open to discussion, and we would love to hear your views about that subject. Okay, with this brief, let me humbly introduce our speaker. Here it is, Professor Eric Schluessel, that's his name. Dr. Schluessel is an assistant professor of Chinese history and politics at the University of Montana and holds a PhD in history and East Asian languages from Harvard University. With this humble introduction, please welcome Dr. Schluessel.
Thank you for a very kind introduction. I'm really, really happy to be back in New England, especially in Vermont. I actually like the weather. It's a lovely state, and I'm happy to be addressing this crowd. Thank you very much to the Crook family for being such wonderful hosts as well, and to the Windham World Affairs Council for having me here. I just wish I were here on a slightly happier note. See, I've made a career out of trying to connect people in the US and China, and to bring mutual cultural understanding to both sides. That is how I spent the last 19 years of my life. But over the past 2 years, a new issue has emerged that I feel I can no longer stay silent about as a China professional, as a professor, and as a friend. Because many of my colleagues and friends, people I know well, people I've worked with, have been disappeared, put in re-education centers or prisons on account of their ethnicity, and they are apparently joined by up to 1 million other people like them. And so I have to talk about that tonight. And hopefully next time I come back, it'll be on a happier note. So the area we're talking about tonight, I'll give you a broad overview first, because we all need that kind of grounding, is indeed called Xinjiang. Okay, Xinjiang, now also called East Turkestan, and it's this peculiar area in orange here, which we might think of as China's Central Asia. It is a part of China that is in the Central Asian cultural area, but within Chinese borders. That's why we might call it East Turkestan, to emphasize that it is related intimately to West Turkestan, out in Russian Central Asia, as it used to be known. Xinjiang has a checkered history. It's been more or less part of China since the mid-18th century, with sporadic periods of independence. And since the 1750s, is born this name Xinjiang, which means new territory, simply because it was the newest territory appended to the old Qing Empire. It remains part of the People's Republic of China today. The majority of people who live there are known as the Uyghur people in English, or Uyghur in Uyghur. You can say Uyghur, it's closer to the actual pronunciation, but in English we say Uyghur. Now, these are people who speak a Turkic language, which is really radically different from Chinese. It's like Uzbek is related to Turkish, and who practice Sunni Islam almost universally with a heavy overlay of Sufism. You'd be hard-pressed to find a single Uyghur who doesn't engage in some kind of Sufi ritual. You might have heard of Rumi, Jami, poets like these. Sufism is a big part of Uyghur life. They've historically been the majority in Xinjiang until about the 1980s, when major migration of people we might call Han Chinese, what we think of as typically Chinese from China proper, started shifting that population balance in the region. We often like to say, this is geographically true, that the center of the Uyghur homeland is geographically closer to Baghdad than it is to Beijing. If that gives you a sense of how close culturally the people of Xinjiang are to Persia, Central Asia, Turkey, and the Middle East. So they feel themselves to be very different from the majority Chinese. And historically, well, there's a quote from Gandhi that says something to the effect of, any people would prefer their own bad governance to the good governance of another people. That's generally the attitude among Uyghur people, and has historically been the case. They would generally prefer their own government if you ask any Uyghur in private, but there are always questions about, well, if this was an independent state, how would it work, right? So that's been the general background for this region for the past 60 years or so. And for the past 15, I've had the privilege of learning the Uyghur language, working with Uyghur people, writing about the region, documenting things happening there, and mainly I'm a historian. I work in the 19th century, but here we are discussing things in the 2010s. So to understand the present situation there, and the reason why my friends are imprisoned, and many others like them, here's a little diagram that might help. It's a complicated system, but we'll unpack it during the talk. Now, right now, we have re-education camps that are well documented, detention centers where people are held without trial, and prisons. Those are kind of the simplest thing, holding an estimated 1 million people. And beyond them, the broader society in Xinjiang has been made into a great big surveillance state of unprecedented technological sophistication. It's become China's laboratory for new forms of surveillance, including biometric monitoring, the use of video cameras, facial recognition technology, which we'll return to at the end of the talk. So under surveillance, we have about maybe 10 million more people being monitored almost constantly within this region. And this has only really appeared in the past 2 years. There's been a massive escalation of it. Now, to understand why this is happening, I think we have to understand great international forces of our time. One being an international industry that makes incarcerating people very profitable, and that leads people to invest in things like surveillance and technology, but also the war on terror, which China has used very effectively to its own purposes in Xinjiang, and an overall atmosphere of Islamophobia that serves to justify all sorts of abuses of human beings on the basis of their religion in Western China today. I do not think that China is an Islamophobic state inherently. Rather, I have to emphasize this discourse helps justify and explain for them what's happening in this region. So, to bring it back, I think we can understand the present situation historically if you go back to about the year 2001. Something is loading. And before 2001, I'll just let the slide load, China generally asserted that the Uyghur people were engaged in separatist activities, nationalist, ethnic activities, a desire to form their own state in the far northwest. And And really, back then, protests in the region was pretty rare, because overall, the quality of life was relatively good. It was a pretty stable place. When there was protest, the Chinese government tended to blame it on these so-called separatists, and then would crack down on it pretty harshly. The example I was going to show you, if you're having technical difficulties, is of the 1997 protests in Uyghurs. This is the town of Yiming in Chinese in northwestern Xinjiang, where back in 1997, local groups of men started holding soccer matches. Holding soccer matches and finding ways to promote pro-social attitudes in their communities by reading the Quran together and things like that. Well, that was considered unacceptable to the Chinese government, which cracked down on the soccer matches with tanks on the soccer pitch and shut this down. Supposedly this is separatist activity. Now we're not going to see the video here, and that's okay. That discourse changed in 2001 after 9/11, when the US swiftly took up this rhetoric of the war on terror, a war on a concept, a war on an idea and a system. And China swiftly realized that, well, we have Muslims too. And they started to talk about everything in Xinjiang as a matter of terrorism. Any protest, terrorism. Let's say it was a protest in front of a police station because someone had been locked up unfairly, terrorism. Any action against the state was being reconstrued in terms of Islamic extremism. They even named a couple of organizations that at the time did not exist as terrorist groups, and then the US and the UN both obligingly agreed that yes, these are terrorist groups. So China started to say the East Turkestan Islamic movement was causing all this trouble in the region. Well, as far as we scholars could tell, there wasn't an East Turkestan Islamic movement. There was no evidence of it. But any protest was ascribed to that. Now, the US was pretty complicit in this entire project. These are some of the Uyghur men who were migrating through Afghanistan when the war happened in the fall of 2001. They were picked up and detained in Guantanamo for many years. They were, of course, eventually exonerated, found completely innocent, and they've now been resettled in places like Palau and Bermuda and Croatia and Sweden. They're all over the place. But while they were in Guantanamo, the US allowed access to these men to Chinese interrogators as well, under the assumption that they were also part of this global terrorist movement. So you see how the US has really ignored this problem for a long time and been very complicit in these issues. So after 2001, everything was blamed on the three forces: separatism, terrorism, and Islamic extremism. And yet, if you look at the situation, you still don't see anything that looks like terrorism. Nevertheless, this was a period of the acceleration and the escalation of ethnic conflict in the region. China pursued a program to reduce the scope of the Uyghur language, which had been used in universities and across the public sphere. It was first curtailed in universities, and then they introduced a so-called bilingual education plan, which was in fact a plan to make sure that everyone in every school in Xinjiang only learned in Chinese, so you couldn't use your mother tongue. Apart from that, there were crackdowns on Islamic practice, dancing, Uyghur culture of various kinds, but also in the course of developments, Uyghurs are being disenfranchised from economic benefits as well. Discrimination in the workplace and in hiring practices meant that even as Xinjiang's infrastructure improved, the money for that was going to Han Chinese instead of to Uyghur people. Now, it wasn't necessarily a government policy that happened on the interpersonal level, but that was a broader effect, and it led to a lot of discontent in the region. That broke out in protests on July 5th in Xinjiang, not just in Urumqi, the capital, also in Kashgar and other places. What began as a group of students holding up the Chinese flag, reading from the Chinese Constitution, where there are protections in the Constitution for minority culture and language. This is inscribed in the Chinese Constitution. But it turned into a riot because tensions just snapped. Up to 200 people died, a couple thousand more were injured, there was widespread fire damage across the city, and the retaliation from Han Chinese citizens in the city was even bigger. So eventually they had to shut the city down. Xinjiang lost internet access and outside phone access for the most part for 9 months. Martial law was implemented, soldiers were stationed across the region, where many of them remain today. Now, the message that the administration took away from this was not to back off the oppression of Uyghur culture, but to pile it on some more. It was at this point that scholars in China started saying, listen, there's going to be a backlash from this. Even at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, scholars said hardline policies in Xinjiang will have a boomerang effect. They will just make the discontent worse, and so they did. This is a classic case. It's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. You identify terrorism and crime, you manage to create the categories of terrorism and crime, especially through the capricious policies that China pursued in this period. To try and assimilate Uyghurs, they did things like promoting interethnic marriages, which is not inherently a bad thing, but it led to some very abusive practices at the local level. Right? They tried to encourage more economic developments, which again did not benefit the Uyghurs. It benefited Han Chinese migrants coming in. So the economic inequality got worse. And eventually, in 2014, we did see actual terrorist acts emerge in the region. Nothing large scale. Small bombings, this is probably the biggest event where someone drove 2 trucks together into a main market in Urumqi, and there was an explosion that damaged a number of shops. There was an attack at a train station. There was some fighting down the south, but for the most part, police had identified people who engaged in everyday Islamic activities, like praying at home, and identified them as Islamic extremists who needed to be purged, identified as terrorists and punished. And that led to the backlash on the popular level. Well, what has been the solution to that? In 2016, the former party secretary of Tibet, Chen Quanguo, who had perfected in Tibet something he called grid management, was brought to Xinjiang to implement the same policy. Now, grid management means basically systematic total control. No more piecemeal strategies, no more relying on your neighbor to spy on you. They're going to have a grid system in place where you can move without being seen. So about every 300 to 600 meters, you have a convenience police station. Great name, right? Previously, this is in Urumqi, groups of police had stood on street corners holding these 2-meter-long spiked clubs that were pretty nasty, and they decided that wasn't friendly or very secure, so they built these everywhere. So there's always a police station. The idea is that you're going to feel very safe, at least if you're Han Chinese. If you're Uyghur, you're going to feel monitored. Apart from that, as we'll see, there are cameras everywhere now. There are digital tools being used to monitor people's movements at every turn. I started hearing a little bit about this, but we always thought, okay, it's Xinjiang, they're just playing with another policy. Because previously, this was driven by cronyism. Okay, so let me explain this for a second. Why was there so much securitization in Xinjiang when there's such a low level of violence overall? Well, if you're a typical party functionary and you're assigned to Xinjiang, you want to move out. You don't want to be in Xinjiang, it's a terrible assignment. But what you can do is complain that your area is plagued by terrorism, and that you need security equipment, or that you need construction equipment, you need new buildings, you need major grants from the governments to pay a group of people to build a new tool, or to buy more military equipment. It's very familiar if you've looked at militarization of the police in the US, actually. And so local people in Xinjiang, local officials, were able to take this grant money not only to buy these tools, but to pay their friends, their cousins, and construction companies that they were affiliated with to build new security apparatuses and infrastructure. So we figured this was just going to be more of the same. But no, this is actually a totalizing, widespread policy. It's a new era of security. I'm just going to monitor my time here, because I feel I really need to monitor my time. And it's about in the spring of 2017 that I started getting text messages saying, things are bad here, I'm not going to be able to talk to you anymore, deleting you from my social media, sorry. Or things like, I haven't heard from my parents back home for a while, would you mind holding onto my passport information for me in case I disappear too? Dire messages started coming out, and by the fall of 2017, many people I knew had disappeared entirely. It was that, oh yes, grid management, by the way, also entailed a major hiring of new security and police personnel. So you can see a major spike in the needs of the security forces for part-time police officers. This is a way of extending the security apparatus out into the popular level so that you're not just hiring specialists, you have any random unskilled worker can become a low-level police officer. So that's how you have one every street corner and at the entrance of every restaurant, every bookstore, etc. So you can look at my friend's story. I think it was published in Foreign Policy a while back about a summer in detention. He's a guy who's been studying in the US, and he went back home for a summer in Shanghai. The police picked him up, he's a Uyghur of course, and said, we just need to talk to you. They zip-tied his hands, put him on a train for 2 days back to Xinjiang, where he did not have a chance to eat along the way. His family did not know where he was because he's supposed to get a forward flight from Shanghai to Xinjiang. He wasn't at the airport. Eventually they figured out that he'd been put in one of these detention centers, so he was disappeared. Put in a great big room with many other Uyghur men, very crowded, and interrogated regularly about his activities abroad. So he was informed by other inmates, other detainees, that anyone in this detention center was either suspected of having Islamic extremist thoughts or had been abroad. So anyone who would say studied in Cairo or Saudi Arabia or Syria or Turkey even was suspect, and a lot of them were put into these detention centers. Now my friend fit into neither category. Well, he'd been abroad, sure, but a secular guy living in America. At the end of the summer, they let him out and said, there was a clerical error. We got a guy with the wrong name, another familiar story from the US. And just don't tell anyone what happened here or we'll make things difficult for you. Well, his story eventually came out in the American press, which I appreciate. You can look it up if you like. I think it's called A Summer in Detention, something along those lines. But he was living off a roll and boiled water every day for the summer, so he lost a lot of weight. It was really sad to see him on the way home. As for the imprisoned, okay, so just here are a few examples of people who have been put into a detention center or into a prison system. You have clerics like Muhammad Salahadin, who's a Uyghur cleric, who's an official cleric. He's part of the official Islamic association, and once upon a time, he, at the request of the Chinese government, translated the Quran into Uyghur. He was later detained in 2017 for having translated the Quran. If you see the irony there, there's a lot of this. So Yasin John was a student who'd been in Egypt, passed away in detention. It's not just Uyghurs though, other critics of the Chinese government of the situation in Xinjiang, like Zhang Haitao, a common worker, have been imprisoned or detained on pretty flimsy excuses. Supposedly Zhang Haitao was sending secrets abroad. He was sending newspapers to friends abroad. A little closer to home, here are a couple of my colleagues who have disappeared. Professor Rahila Dawood is a really well-regarded professor of ethnology at Xinjiang University, a great friend to many of us who work on Xinjiang as scholars, and she's very respected in the region as well. Now, Rahila Dawood works on Islam, but she's certainly no Islamic extremist. She's a scholar. Last I heard, well, she disappeared on her way back from a conference in Beijing, and has supposedly been sentenced to at least 10 years in prison on some flimsy excuse. Why? You have to wonder, why would you do that? Especially someone like Abdurrahim Rahman, the professor of history and literature, who similarly, he'd just been abroad, doing some research work, comes back to China, and has been disappeared for the past 2 years. Okay, these are both people who work on Islam. They're students of Islam, scholars of Islam, so you figure maybe they're making a connection, maybe they're being too cautious when they're detaining these people or imprisoning them. Well, what about these two? Former presidents of Xinjiang University and Xinjiang Medical. This guy, since the 1980s, has been a well-regarded scholar of dryland agriculture. And like Rahila, he's published abroad. He's a well-known scholar. He does good, hard science research. He's been sentenced to death for separatism. This guy was a party member. What about Halmar Kholpur, president of Xinjiang Medical University? Has been accused of wanting to start a caliphate, an Islamic state in Xinjiang. Apparently on the basis of someone having written a letter saying that he had an Islamic upbringing. What the heck is going on here when hard scientists are being put into prisons and detention camps? He has a suspended death sentence, by the way. Well, it looks like the Cultural Revolution, which is a period in China when you could accuse someone on often some pretty flimsy bases. And if it was convenient for the people in charge, you could be thrown into prison. One of the things I think is that one of his enemies, possibly the university party secretary, decided that he needed to be gotten out of the way and made an accusation that would have helped fill the quotas, and there are quotas, for Islamic extremists sent into re-education centers and prisons. So this is the situation we're in that nearly every single person I know in the region is currently in some kind of camp or prison, partly for having known me. Not that I have that much guilt about that. Anyway, it's complicated. But the term they use for people who are, say, party members, who are secular Uyghurs, and who do things like drink and smoke and things that make them look like they're part of mainstream secular Chinese culture is two-faced person. 两面人. This means that no matter how much you perform loyalty on the outside, in your heart, you are harboring anti-state or anti-party thoughts. Now, this is an accusation that you can't get out of, no matter how much you want to prove your innocence, because it's based on someone else knowing something that is inside you that you never even knew was there to begin with. So you see the situation we're dealing with. Okay, so what about the camps themselves? Now, China at first was very proud of these re-education centers before the world kind of realized what this looked like when you have 1 million people in camps. And started posting, this is from official media, photographs of their efforts. So this is a massive, newly constructed network of re-education centers and camps. And see, this is a group of Uyghur men. They're usually gender segregated, these camps. And we can even identify some of them in here. This is a great social equalizer. So this fellow has a degree from a university in Shanghai. This fellow, if I recall correctly, is a Haji, but he's also a restaurateur. This guy, he has a clerical background. He's memorized the Quran. That's how he's known. This guy is a grandfather and a carpenter. So at this point, if you're a Uyghur person, it doesn't matter what your social background is, really. You're going to get sent to the camps if they find you suspect. There are a lot of reasons they might find you suspect. We'll get to the list in a few minutes. Okay, how do we know about them? Because there are a lot of public documents that accidentally reveal purchasing orders for these camps. And I can show you more in another PowerPoint if you like. But that one we have a photograph of in Hotan. So they have purchased police batons, cattle prods, handcuffs, and pepper spray. So the Chinese government will tell you that these are camps to either eliminate extremist thoughts or to give people job skills. Now, first of all, what does a grandfather and a carpenter need with more job skills? Especially if he's already retired. But two, what does a mandatory adult boarding school need with cattle prods and pepper spray? Reports have come out from the people who've gotten out of these camps and people who taught in these camps, usually like kindergarten teachers who were forced to change their jobs, about regular torture, beatings, starvation, a 600-calorie-a-day diet, and other sorts of psychological and physical manipulation and torture. Oh, and this is even how Chen Quanguo described this. If you're a student of Foucault, how is a school like a prison, like a hospital? Well, it's a school. It's supposed to be managed like the military and is defended like a prison. And the rhetoric about these places is that we need to isolate the Uyghurs so that we can clean out their extremist thoughts. Isolate, sanitize. We even have photographs of them because we know where they are. They have addresses. A lot of them used to be schools, in fact, or hospitals that have been converted by adding new dormitories. And here's a photo of one with one of the guard towers, the razor wire on top, the extra layer of fencing, police station in front, because they can be visited. You can sometimes visit your relatives in these. We also know from satellite imagery that these things have been built. Sean Zhang, who's a law student up in Canada, and Adrian Zenz are a couple scholars who've done a lot of work identifying the locations and working with architects to figure out what are these made of. So here we see in Kashgar, Shula County, a place where a re-education camp was built. You can see the dormitories here. We have fencing, we have a yard. There are dozens of others that have been identified by satellite photos. This is one of the things that actually forced the Chinese government to acknowledge the camps. So first it was, we just said, no, this doesn't exist, and it was the re-education centers were doing a good thing. Then they had to actually put in law that they could do this because it was not legal at the time. And now, well, they're trying to say that these are a good thing. They started letting Western reporters in to sort of Potemkin village-style re-education camps. We're starting to get a view inside. And a lot of what happens inside when the reporters come is, well, for example, they had a group of Western reporters in one of the camps, and the detainees were made to sing the song in English, "If You're Happy and You Know It." Now, okay, that sounds ridiculous, right? It's absurd. So either we think the Chinese think that this is actually a sign that the camps are working, no one's that stupid, or it's, look at us, we can make our prisoners do whatever we want. This is a sign of power. There's a lot of sort of singing, dancing, and control of people's movements in these camps. So a big part of the education, I want to find a video of this because there's an official Chinese video of this, where students are happily learning Chinese calligraphy and singing Beijing opera. So they're learning culturally Chinese things, essentially Chinese things and movements, right? The idea being that if you change your behaviors, you'll change your heart. If you learn to speak Chinese, which is a big part of the camp curriculum, you'll change your heart. If you read Chinese law instead of the Quran, you'll change your heart and become a legal citizen rather than a Muslim reader of the Quran. Well, a video was smuggled out of Uyghur prisoners being made to sing for their supper. Sorry, it was by Japanese reporters. But this is the song, "If there were no Communist Party, there would be no new China." And so, if you look closely, their hands are zip-tied together, and they're apparently waiting for their dinner. This was, according to the person who leaked this video, the requirement of getting a meal. Now, there is an endpoint for your time in the camps. People who have gotten out are often sent to sort of work release programs. So here we have factory workers in an industrial park in Kashgar. So the detainees or re-educatees have learned job skills, right? So whatever their background was, they've learned to operate some sort of machine. And typically, they're then put in situations where they're in a factory dorm for 6 days a week, working at this factory for pennies an hour, and they're released 1 day a week to go back and see their family. So this is one of the reasons the camps might exist, is to feed workers into what's effectively slave labor, or very near to it. Oh, wow, time. I'm not great on time. I have a lot to talk about. I may go over the 45 minutes, and I apologize. Cool.
It's great.
So, all right, I'll take it. So far that seems to be the end game, is to put people into these forced labor situations. And sort of, it's kind of an employment program, I guess, but where is this? Here it is. If we get the video to work, I'll ask my friend to tell us what he thinks about that. Because really, I see my job as a historian as putting Uyghur voices forward, making a space for Uyghur voices and trying to amplify them. But as PowerPoint's not collaborating, I'll simply say, my friend Mirshad is an amazing guy, Mirshad Ghalib, and he put up a video on YouTube. So this guy, he's a grad student, he's an anthropologist, he loves lifting weights, he is an absolutely lovely human being. And he made a video on YouTube asking, why is his retired librarian mother in prison? You can look up the video. I find it very, very moving. I recommend that you do. So to the question of why she's in prison, or why she's in a re-education camp. This is small, but there's a list of reasons commonly given for being sent to these camps. And they include, okay, there are some that speak to the collection of biometric data. So people who have refused to give DNA samples. So there's a universal health check program in Xinjiang right now, which seems to be only universal health checks for non-Han Chinese people. And if you do not get the health check, which involves taking swabs, DNA samples, voice recordings, scans of irises, etc., then you are sent to a re-education camp. Let's see, if you speak your native language in school, that's a sign of disloyalty. If you, somewhere on here it says, if you act sad when your parents die, which is a good one. Owning multiple knives, you have to, by the way, register each knife you buy in Xinjiang. It's a real pain in the neck. Abstain from alcohol and cigarettes. So that China wants you to drink and smoke if you're Uyghur. In fact, they forced shopkeepers to stock cigarettes and alcohol, despite these being against common Islamic practice in this area, and embodiment of alcohol being, depending on your interpretation of the Quran, against the Quran. So, these are all issues, but probably the biggest ones are having a full beard, and things like eating before the sun comes up. Now, what's that about? Well, right now it's Ramadan, okay? So Muslims are fasting during the day, and that includes Uyghur people, if they're practicing Muslims. Ramadan has been curtailed further and further in Xinjiang, a lot like Uyghur language. At first, it was university students who used to have their own Muslim cafeterias to break the fast, then didn't have those cafeterias. And then, okay, so they had to sneak food into their dorms and eat it before dawn or after dusk. Now, for the past few years, there have been mandatory attendance at daytime meals. Why does the Chinese government care so much about when people eat? Well, it's a lot like the singing and the dancing. You have to be sure that everyone's doing the same rituals, that they're all acting the same, that they're all acting Chinese, whatever you think Chinese is. You have to be sure that they look like normal citizens. Like this, in Project Beauty. So this is a project that's going on for a few years and it's still part of the camp system. This was an effort to get Uyghur women to, in the Chinese government's words, show the world your beauty. Stop wearing headscarves and looking in the mirror and seeing, this is a terrible propaganda image. It's really crude. Stop looking in the mirror and seeing a dead person in a hijab and start wearing colorful clothes and showing off your femininity to the world. Recently there was even a skirt shortening program, which was well documented in Chinese media. Nothing I'm saying here is not well documented in the media, by the way. In the camps too, testimonies taken from women for Chinese media talk about how much they've loved freeing their hair and learning the skills of a beautician. So that now they know that their beauty is what matters. This is part of a broader thing happening with gender in China right now, by the way, where the state's really encouraging more traditional gender roles, and it's something worth looking into. But it's encouraged in the camps where they actually have posters up of what a woman should look like. And it's not someone wearing very much, it's a woman wearing a lot of makeup. There are posters everywhere showing what not to wear. So you can wear ethnic clothing, which is colorful and bright and consumable, but not dark or Islamic clothing. You also can't wear a big beard. That's a picture of Keanu Reeves, by the way. But you can't wear a big beard or anything that might suggest that you're Muslim. Okay, so it's an attempt to secularize people. That's part of what's going on here if we tease it out. Okay, so you've talked a little bit about what happens in the camps and the reasons for it. Now we're bleeding out of the camps into the broader society. The other ways we try to discipline Uyghurs, make them act certain ways. And here's one of the most invasive ones, is that thousands of Chinese and often Mongol, actually, people, mostly teachers and civil servants, have been sent into Uyghur homes to stay as guests. Wow. Right? Now, some of them are staying full-time, they're fully embedded, and they tend to put diaries up on social media. This guy, I forget what his background was, but he's talked on his own blog, I guess, we've been calling it for 20 years, about how in a Uyghur home, he asked the man, "Do you drink?" Now, if you say, "I don't drink," what's going to happen to you? You're going to be suspected of Islamic extremism. So the guy says, of course, well, sure, I drink. And the Chinese guy brings out a bottle of alcohol, he's very proud of this, and gets the Uyghur man to have a few glasses with him. These visitors, of course, are asking questions about members of the household to judge their loyalty. And often they'll ask the children things like, "Does your daddy read the Quran?" Or they'll give them a bit of candy to try and gain their affection, gain their attention, or take advantage of splits within the household to play family members off of each other. Now, not everyone's embedded in the home. That woman certainly is embedded in the home. She's in a bed with two other people who she's monitoring. But these are folks with notebooks who are taking notes on your movements, your attitudes, the things that you say. If you're not speaking Chinese, obviously that's a sign of possible disloyalty. So people are being monitored in their own neighborhoods and houses. Now, I pity the people who are being sent out to be visitors, by the way. A lot of them do not like this job. They never wanted it. They want to be middle school teachers. And instead they've been sent to some village in the desert to hang out in someone's home who doesn't want them there. This isn't a very effective program. There's one wonderful anecdote a guy was supposed to be monitored, and so he met up with his monitor, but the guy didn't have a fixed address, so he said, listen, I don't really have a place for you to stay. And the monitor basically said, just get me lunch once a week, I'll tell them I'm staying with you. So here on the grassroots level, nothing works quite like you think it will. Right, so this is also, by the way, from official media, the Communist Youth League of Xinjiang. Okay, so clearly, we're monitoring people even in private life. But there are other ways of ensuring that you don't have to rely on human error or human capacities to keep track of people, and that is through biometric data, which is a huge industry in China right now. It's booming. If you want something to invest in, and please don't, this is one of the best industries you could go for right now. So here's an example of, this is a common checkpoint. Now, there are now checkpoints everywhere in Uyghur parts of town. They were already at every bus stop and every subway stop, right? Or they're building a subway. But now they're in front of nearly every institution, every shop. If you don't have a formal checkpoint staffed by police, say you're running a restaurant, one of your workers has to be on guard duty at any given time of the day, right? And they've distributed these devices that match your ID card, which you swipe here, to your biometric data. There's my friend Ryan, who's a historian of Xinjiang also, having his face scanned by this device. And if it sees that there's anything out of order, it won't let you through. Or if it knows that you've committed an infraction of some kind or that you're suspect, then you don't get let through the checkpoint, and then you have to turn around and walk home. Now that's interesting, because your biometric data is connected to a bunch of data about you. Okay, well, there are also these, this is a New York Times photo. Video cameras are everywhere, by the way, so make note of this. You're being watched wherever you go. So is your car and anything that is associated with you. Okay, and here's how we're collecting data about a person. Recently, Human Rights Watch got hold of and reverse engineered an app being used by the police to take notes on individual people and build this massive database. And it includes the photo, a photo that you're supposed to compare to the person's face when you see it, other data about them, height, but also education level, profession, your car, all sorts of stuff like they monitor your electricity usage. So if you're using electricity at a weird time of day, maybe you're holding a secret meeting or something, or maybe you just got up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom, hard to say. This is also attached to a set of QR codes, by the way. So everyone's got QR codes on their door, those four-sided barcode things. And so for a while, they were coming around every night and scanning the barcodes on your door to make sure everyone who was registered to live in that apartment was there. So, okay, we've got all that. And you might think it's all theater. You might think, okay, this is like in the US, or maybe it isn't like in the US. We just make people feel like they're being monitored all the time so that they'll watch themselves. But recently, some data was leaked. And about 2.5 million people, Muslim people in Xinjiang, Uyghur people and others in Xinjiang, were listed in this database with all of their personal data, including where they'd last been seen, according to where they'd scanned their ID, where their license plate had been seen, or where a video camera picked up on their face and logged their location. And you can actually make a map. This is Urumqi. And you can get a whole map of where people have been moving around. So people are actually being monitored by the Public Security Bureau, by the police, etc. This is why I say it's probably the most technologically sophisticated surveillance state ever created. The Stasi could only dream of this, of having an instant recognition of where someone is by getting a flash of their face on a video camera and identifying them. So Xinjiang, however, is mainly, it's a test bed for this technology. They've deployed some of it in China proper as well. Recently, the police boasted that they'd identified a person in a crowd at a concert just from their biometric data, from their face. They were able to go in and arrest him. Of course, the US uses biometric data as well. In part because, well, it can be pretty effective, but also it's a very profitable industry. So here's one of the promotional image for one of the big companies that produces the equipment and the software used for surveillance, Megvii, which makes Face++. And Face++ could be used for a lot of things. It could be used to use your face to open your cell phone. it could be used for medical applications. And supposedly the staff who made Face++ aren't aware of its usage in Xinjiang to monitor and track people's movements. But it's the software that's being used. There are a number of other companies like SenseTime, Maya, Dahua, who are involved in this industry and are making quite a lot of money off of it. And indeed, a couple of them have been lobbying pretty effectively in the US as well. Hikvision, which makes video cameras used in the camps and across Xinjiang in neighborhoods, has put nearly $1 million into lobbying the US Congress in the past 2 years. And one of their lobbyists is in fact a former congressman from Virginia. So, okay, and then what about MEGV? Well, MEGV is actually invested in by a company owned by the son of a leading presidential candidate in the US. I'm not saying this to say that there's some sort of conspiracy at work, but to point out that this is involved in a big diffuse field that stretches across the entire world. You could be investing in this and not know about it. You should have more responsibility for how you invest. But money and business tends to create this plausible deniability for people, right? That's just my stock portfolio. I'm just making money from this. I don't know how this is used. Well, this is where I think we actually have leverage as concerned people, and I hope by now you're concerned. If you are the sorts of people who have stocks, check your portfolios to see, are you investing in Xinjiang, are you investing in prison labor? If your company uses a lot of tomato paste, for example, you might not realize that one of the world's biggest sources of tomato paste is Xinjiang, and that some of the companies making it have been using prison labor. For example, a certain company, the name of which I wrote down but I keep forgetting, Thermo something, I apologize, had made some of the software and equipment that was being used to collect DNA samples in Xinjiang. Thermo Fisher, that was it. And when they were informed that their equipment was being used in this way, instead of for medical applications, they pulled their product from the region. So that has been some degree of pushback against the surveillance and the incarceration. It also helps prevent it from generating profit for people, which I think is one of the main drivers of this. There's an athletic apparel company in China that was using prison labor from the re-education camps in Xinjiang, and that was selling to a number of American universities. Now, we pushed back against that, and the universities stopped buying from them. There are little levers here and there because the Chinese and American economies are so entangled, where I do think that we can use our awareness of these issues to push back against the heightening of this problem. I'm sure the technology also exists, but I think it's a start. Now, what else can we possibly do? Now, right now in the Senate and the House, there's the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act, which is a bipartisan, bicameral bill at this point. It was introduced last year. It has more support this year. There's a decent chance of passing. And it does a couple of things. It puts sanctions on Chen Quanguo and Xi Jinping, the president of China, by invoking the Global Magnitsky Act, which you've probably heard about. And it would also establish a permanent position to monitor the situation in Xinjiang. Like we have one for Tibet, there would then be, in the State Departments, a specific person there to monitor the Xinjiang situation. Now, to me, this is small potatoes. To me, this is saying, okay, in 120 days, we'll write a report. In a year, we'll have an office. We might put some sanctions on one guy who's running the show in Xinjiang, but it doesn't dismantle the system. By the way, this has support from Sanders, Leahy, and Welch. Good job, Vermont. I've heard nothing from New Hampshire so far, so just saying, if you can, write to your representatives and senators. One of the things that's really worked to try and reveal things happening in the camps has been highlighting the specific cases of individuals who we know are in there, like Abdurrahim Hayat, the great dutar player and musician. Now, Abdurrahim Hayat was detained in the fall of 2017, if I recall correctly, and there was a rumor that he had died. An artist working in the US, a Uyghur, had produced this wonderful image of him, and it's part of a series of images. And basically, so much pressure was put on China through social media, but also the Turkish government, interestingly, by Uyghurs living in Turkey, to try and find out his situation. That eventually China released a video of him addressing his fans to show that he was still alive. This has been a very effective strategy so far for people whose family members they haven't seen in a year and a half or 2 years, is to put out on social media the so-called Me Too Uyghur campaign, hashtag Me Too Uyghur. Now, we all thought it was a little problematic at first because it's using the Me Too movement, but it's been really effective in terms of highlighting the missing and something that China's responded to. They respond to embarrassments. And so some of these people are now able to talk once a week to their family members. The police will arrange it for them. They use a policeman's cell phone. In exchange, they have to take down their social media posts. But it's a way of ensuring an ongoing connection with a family member where you don't know what their situation is, if they're alive, how well they're being fed, etc. So I do think that China does respond to embarrassments and problems with its image on the world stage. But the other thing that we can really do if you're concerned is to amplify Uyghur voices. There are Uyghur-run organizations out there that are doing a good job, like Atajurt in Kazakhstan. Now, its leader, Serikjan Bilash, has actually been detained by the Kazakh government for the past couple of months because he was doing a great job of taking testimonies from people who had worked in the camps, including many Kazakhs in Xinjiang who were interned, and putting them online, making videos, and advocating for the release of further detainees. And the Kazakhstani government is not very happy about that right now. But supporting Atajurt and their efforts, I think, is very effective. The Uyghur Human Rights Project, based in New York, does very responsible, high-quality reporting on these issues. They're very reliable. But there are also things like the Xinjiang Victims Database, which is now up to 4,000 testimonies, which is a drop in the barrel. See, here's the thing about testimonies. They're mostly coming from people with international connections, with educations, but what about all the farmers and the poor people in these camps? They're not as well known. But shahid.biz, that's the address, is a good start. It's entirely volunteer run, and they rely on things like donations to make sure that they can get all the data entered because they have a ton of testimonies that they want to put online. But one thing I think my Uyghur colleagues would also want me to say is read Uyghur poetry. I have a new friend in the audience who knows a great translator of Uyghur poetry, Josh Freeman. If you Google him and Uyghur poetry, you'll find some of the most remarkable, beautiful pieces of modernist poetry you have ever heard. Because I think we should remember that the people in these camps, these people in this situation, are not merely detainees, but they're members of a people with a culture who want to be known better for their history and their art and their literature. So these are things that I think my Uyghur friends would want you to amplify to try and help their people and themselves out of this terrifying situation. So to sum it up, I'll simply say, my friends are in prison, so are a million other people like them for being who they are. I find this fundamentally unjust, and I hope you feel the same, that you'll do something to act on it. Thank you again for having me, and look forward to the conversation.
You are most welcome to ask any question, but please make your question brief so everyone here has a chance to ask a question and get an answer. So those who have questions, please raise their hand. Let's start. You decide what.
Just ask them,
Yes, please.
ask them to state their name
And please state your name
Okay.
so we can address inform CIA, FBI.
It's okay with me if you give a pseudonym, I'm just saying.
Tom McLaughlin.
wait.
The microphone?
This guy raised his hand, so I went back there.
Hi, Tom McLaughlin from Brattleboro. I'm embarrassed to say that I don't know what countries are predominantly Sunni. You said they're Sunni Muslims. What's China's relationship with Sunni countries, and is there any pushback there?
There's an excellent question. Most Islamic countries, predominantly Muslim countries, are Sunni, for the most part. So that would count places like Turkey, for example, which should be a natural ally to their Turkic brothers. Places like Pakistan, like most Muslim countries are Sunni countries. And there's been very little pushback from them. Just as there's been very little pushback from most Muslim countries on the Palestinian issue, because of close economic ties with China. Places like Pakistan are deeply tied to China through the new Belt and Road Initiative that stretches across Asia. and that's meant to form a new economic community. It's just like the US, you can't anger China without fear of economic repercussions. So there's been a little bit here and there. Like when Turkey demanded to know about Abdurrahim's whereabouts and whether or not he was alive. That's because he's so popular in Turkey that they felt they had to say something for their internal politics. And at one point, the Turkish government, many years ago, referred to what was happening in Xinjiang as genocide, but they backed off that as well. There's been more pushback from organizations in those countries, from many people in Pakistan, because there are actually a lot of cross-border marriages. There are Pakistani men with Uyghur wives, especially. And that has resulted in some movement as well. But from places like Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Syria, there's really been very little. And that's frustrating for Uyghurs. It's very frustrating not to hear from the rest of the Muslim world. Thank you.
The question back there. Good evening. Thank you, Eric, for a very interesting and also sobering program tonight. I'm Bill Gunther from Bench Mountain in Newfane. And my question is, given your outspokenness in doing presentations like this, are you able to go back to Xinjiang at this point? Or when was the last time you were here?
I was last in China in the summer of 2017. At that time, I did not go to Xinjiang because I had heard the situation was bad. And given that imprisonment seems to have a lot to do with foreign connections, I thought it would be irresponsible to show my face and try to work with anyone. I can't do much in the region anyway to begin with. But I could go back to China. In fact, that summer I gave a public talk for an hour on my research in the region. Two, in fact. Yeah, I was at 2 meetings that summer. China's a very heterogeneous place.
Did you do that? You didn't do that in the region?
Not in the region itself, I couldn't go, but elsewhere. China's a big and very heterogeneous place, not just ethnically, but in terms of its political terrain. Many scholars of this region have been banned. It's been a while, but it was a really exceptional event when that happened. You really have to anger the wrong people in the wrong way at the wrong time to get banned. And so far, I think because I'm fundamentally China friendly. I fundamentally want to build bridges. If anyone is monitoring what I'm saying, I hope that they can see that I'm what they would call a friendly critic, as many scholars of Tibet have been for many, many years. I don't want to be a cold warrior or anything like that, just my friends are in prison. That's for all of you watching in Beijing. So far I can go back. I haven't tried recently. We'll see. But for the most part, this has not been a problem for people who are advocating for issues in the region. In fact, recently they've tried to invite scholars to go on delegations to the region and show them the positive side of things.
My name is Kathy McManamy. I'm here from Wisconsin on vacation. And there's so much stuff that is imported from China. I mean, seriously. And just how should we be approaching that?
In terms of this issue,
Yes.
look for the company that makes it. A lot of this stuff is actually Googleable if you try hard enough. And if you just see the company's based in Xinjiang, you might have some suspicions about the kind of labor that they're using in that area. You can't be fully aware because the supply chain usually takes raw goods from Xinjiang in the northwest and manufactures somewhere in China proper. So you never know where the ultimate source of stuff is. I tend not to buy too many Chinese products myself anyway. It's because I think consumerism is not a good thing, and because I prefer to support the American economy. But look online. Volkswagen, interestingly, they have a plant out in Xinjiang. The president of VW recently claimed that he didn't know about the situation. Well, who knows what their supply chain actually looks like in the region and how their labor practices look. I'd say, especially when it's an international company that's more transparent about what they do, look into that. But overall, I would reduce my consumption of Chinese goods just on the principle of being concerned about these issues. Sorry, I don't have a more nuanced approach.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi, I'm Emily Jones. There are thousands of Chinese students in American colleges. Is there any indication that they're getting interested in this the way they're interested in a lot of other political topics?
This is really interesting. So I invite you to look up friend of mine, Darren Byler, B-Y-L-E-R, who's written a lot in very nuanced ways about this, including on recent encounters with Chinese students. There's a big bifurcation. So we're always afraid when we do these things that there's going to be a group of students who've been organized by the Chinese Students Association who are going to storm the talk and protest, and that does happen in some people's classes. It did happen at a recent talk, partly because Chinese students don't want to see their country insulted, which I understand. Partly because if you don't protest, there can be questions about your loyalty as well. I would have a lot of trouble blaming a young person abroad in a difficult situation for what they do in a situation like that. But there have been many young Chinese students who see these things and see that they're well-sourced, often from Chinese media sources, and think, okay, something is wrong here. And that's what I've actually heard from a lot of older Chinese folks and a number of younger students as well. They say, I love my country. I fundamentally want to do well. This particular thing concerns me. I think it helps when people like me frame it in those terms too. I love China. This particular thing really concerns me, right? And that's a better way of building that bridge. I'm sure that there are other speakers who are more bombastic and anti-China. I think that a lot of the politicians in this country who talk about Uyghur issues are more anti-China than pro-Uyghur, and that's not helping things. But overall, I've seen a lot more mutual understanding when I talk to Chinese students and Chinese people than I have seen backlash.
Hi, I'm John Hagan from Guilford, Vermont. I had a question about the parallels between Uyghur, or that province, and Tibet. And in comparing the two, what would you take out of that in terms of how you see this progressing forward, in terms of how the Chinese government is behaving?
So Chen Quanguo was the party secretary of Tibet before he was the party secretary of Xinjiang. Tibet was his testing ground for all these policies. Tibet is a much smaller population, much smaller compared to Xinjiang, and it has a much simpler infrastructure, so it's easier to control. But Tibet, after protests in recent years, has quieted down tremendously, at least in terms of what we know about the place. And so I think that Xi Jinping, the president of China, saw that as being very effective, and he thinks that the same thing will happen in Xinjiang. And indeed, there have been fewer protests and incidents in Xinjiang since they locked up 10% of the Uyghur population. It makes sense, right? Everyone knows someone who's in a re-education camp or a prison. They're going to be pretty quiet. What is the end game is a great question here. Once you've built dozens of prison complexes, what are they for? Well, one thing we're hearing about is that Uyghur detainees are being sent to prisons in China proper. And there's a concern that once these methods are tested in the West against minority populations, they'll be used in Eastern China against ordinary people, like Han Chinese citizens as well. And that Xinjiang will effectively become China's Siberia, its new Gulag archipelago. Because supposedly the end game is to re-educate people, cleanse them of bad thoughts. One, that's a constantly moving bar. You can never cleanse someone of bad thoughts because there's never conclusive proof that they no longer think things. So we could have an endless internal war in Xinjiang that always uses Uyghurs as this object of violence for the state. Or maybe this is a testing ground for something bigger that will happen across China. I don't see this turning out the way they think it will. I don't think that they're going to create a generation of loyal citizens. If you think in a very dark way, and I'll sort of conclude on this, the Soviet Union in its later years used many orphans in Central Asia, wards of the state, to run its party apparatus in its government. Many of the party secretaries of what became Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, etc. were wards of the state. And we are hearing that the detainees' children are being sent to orphanages and told that their parents are dead. We may wonder if there is going to be a lost generation that the party then finds to raise up as a new leadership in place of these intellectuals who have been imprisoned. Maybe that's the end game. It sounds like a conspiracy theory, lunatic theory, but at this point, who knows? Anything goes.
Paul Lowe from here in Brattleboro. You said you were last in the region 2 years ago.
Yeah.
Did you have a minder?
I was not in the Xinjiang region. I wouldn't be surprised if I had a minder in this case. I know that the last time I was in the region proper was 3 years ago, and that my room was searched, and that the one time I left my laptop away from my body, and I went out and had a beer with a friend. I came back, the whole room was in disarray, my laptop was open, they'd been smoking in the room just to prove a point. I wouldn't be surprised if I'd been monitored because my friends are checking in with me pretty frequently. These days, people I know who have been back more recently, and I won't name names, have had minders. There are people who are always around them and are always watching them. That's true of reporters, of course, who are watched very, very closely, but also of ordinary Westerners who are traveling solo in the region. I think it was Nye, right? But a minder is someone who follows you and watches everything you do.
This may be a question that you don't want to answer, and that's fine, but I would like to know that. Some decades ago, I had a friend who was a German Jew. He was an artist. He had escaped before I'm sorry, he was not a German Jew, he was a Dutch Jew. He had escaped before the Germans came into the Netherlands. And I knew him in this country around 1954. And he said to me and to others, "You Americans don't believe it can happen here. It can." And I have been watching very carefully, to the extent that I have information, ways that I feel that it is happening. And I'm curious how one interprets different things that are coming to pass, and at what speed it is beginning to happen here, or maybe more than beginning, and just anything about that I'd really like to know.
I'm on the same wavelength. Most Uyghurs are on the same wavelength too. For years, Uyghurs mostly compared themselves to Palestinians. They thought themselves an occupied people. They watched a lot of Palestinian film. And now the comparison is now very clearly to the events of the Holocaust. Because at first, as I understand it, the idea was not to exterminate an entire people, but eventually that became the idea once you had the apparatus in place. I think, given the global climate of Islamophobia, it is very easy for other people in the world to look at this and say, good. In fact, the New Zealand shooter himself at the mosque in New Zealand said in one of his statements that China was more closely ideologically aligned to him than New Zealand was, or something to that effect. He praised this program as treatment of Muslims. Now,
the program in China.
yeah, and so it's clear that Islamophobes worldwide are picking up on this. It's clear that they're also interested in exterminating peoples. I wouldn't be entirely surprised if it did happen. It seems ridiculous, it seems impossible, because it seems like a terrible idea, a foolish thing to do, and I want to think better of the Chinese authorities, who are usually more sensible about these things. But that seems to be where we're headed. I don't want to prognosticate, but I have the same worries you do.
Bradford Green. What I'd like to know is, what has the relationship of Russia or the Soviet Union in Xinjiang?
Okay, it's a long,
Just
complicated relationship.
repeat the question.
Yeah, so the question is, what's the relationship of Russia and the Soviet Union been to Xinjiang province? So one interesting thing about Xinjiang historically is that it's often been sort of more part of the Russian or Soviet sphere of influence. Back in the 30s, even through the mid-1950s, it was the Soviets who were building the oil extraction apparatuses. Oh, by the way, Xinjiang has coal, oil, copper, natural gas, so you can see why China wants it, and so did the Soviets. And it was the Soviets who really pushed Uyghur ethnicity back from the 1930s onwards. So it's intimately connected. In fact, these days I'd say that Uyghurs tend to look more to the West than to the East for their cultural touchstones. They talk about reading Pushkin, but they don't talk about reading Chinese authors. So there's a pretty intimate relationship there. These days, Russia doesn't really have much of an interest in the region. It's more like Kazakhstan. There's a lot of cross-border collaboration between Kazakhstan and China, working in Xinjiang, building new railroads and connecting trade routes. And the idea is sort of to reorient Eurasia from being north-south, connecting Russia to Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, to east-west, connecting China to Turkey via all the space in between, and to the port at Gondar on the Red Sea in Pakistan. So I hope that answers your question. I could give a lecture on that, though.
Milton Eaton here in Brattleboro. My last time in Western China was one of the more quiet periods, although there was talk of the terrorism and blowing up Stalin's Mao's statues and so on.
What was that?
Well, I'm sorry?
When was that?
4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah, okay. Still a good time.
But one of my professors back in the 50s who had escaped from Germany when we were first having the computers, he was totally against these new developments because, in his opinion, if Hitler had had computers, no one would have escaped because it would have been a button pushing to print the names rather than having people carefully write them down. And the last time I was in London, outside my hotel room was a camera that not only watched who was in the road, but gave parking tickets to cars that were parked too long by just monitoring it with a camera. So I think all of us need to worry about government intrusion here and all over the Western world, as well as in Western China.
I think it can be a double-edged sword. London is one of the most heavily monitored cities I've ever been to. I agree with you, there are cameras everywhere. But a lot of these technologies are also used for medical applications. Yeah, there's a question in the back corner for after. For medical applications and things like that, or fairly pedestrian uses, things that you might actually enjoy that make life more convenient. But they can also be weaponized in this way. So I think it's one of the arguments for the humanities, right? The sciences will tell you can clone a dinosaur, the humanities will tell you why that's a bad idea, right? Similar thing here. We need to have ethical, responsible uses of technology. And this is an example of very unethical use of technology. So, but there's a question all the way in the back.
The lady first.
Okay.
Okay, so my name is Alyssa. I have 2 questions. I'm from China. So first one is, what inspired you to focus on this research? Second, in China, there are 26, right, ethnic minorities. So just to my knowledge, it seems most of the ethnic minorities, they are united in a way that as government planned, right, managed. So what in the core of Uyghurs, right, like make them so resilient? The government has to put all the educational camp, whatever policies to manage, right, like to the end goal to transfer their identity into more Chinese.
It's an excellent question, one that Uyghurs have asked me too. Okay, so out of the 55 minorities across China, officially recognized minorities at least, I remember Uyghurs used to say to me, it's only really the Uyghurs who have maintained their own language, and to some extent the Tibetans, right? Other people have Sinicized, they've become more Chinese over time. Well, for the Uyghurs, it's the part that, okay, back in 1949, the Communist Party leadership recognized a couple of things. They said, one, the Uyghurs are on the same cultural and civilizational level as the Han Chinese, which they've since backed off that. But there's a sense that, well, we're equals in this partnership. And they had also promised before 1949 independence, which was supposed to be guaranteed by the Soviet Union as well. And so there's this memory of independence. There have been 2 small independent republics, both which republic states to some degree, but there's a memory of times of independence. Meanwhile, even under China, Uyghurs have had the chance to really develop their own literature and language in so many ways. The 1980s are remembered as this almost golden age of Uyghur literature, when you could build off 1,000 years of written tradition in the region and produce more art and more literature. There's a great sense of pride in that, especially in the poetry, that is hard to get rid of. Also music, for that matter. There's a classical music tradition among Uyghurs, which is very, very old and very separate. So there's a sense of almost civilizational separateness. I hesitate to use the word civilization, but that's sort of how they would put it, is that they're not really a part of China. They don't need to be part of China. Also, when you talk to anthropologists, they'll say that actually one of the biggest sources of friction when Han Chinese move into Xinjiang it's not just ethnic identity, it's that habits are different. And so Uyghurs in Han wash their hands differently. And like they'll wash their clothes differently. They'll use space differently. And it's very difficult for these two groups of people to socialize, especially when Uyghurs' knowledge of Mandarin Chinese is so low. So just on a day-to-day basis, there's a kind of regular, basic, everyday disconnect. Now, what inspired me to get interested in this research? I began in Chinese language and then linguistics back in the day. I got really interested in linguistic diversity in China because I was living in Harbin, which is in the northeast. And I had a professor who was Manchu, and we talked about Manchu language and Mongol language. I met some Uyghurs, and the Uyghur food's amazing. So it's really good. It's like a combination of Italian, Indian, and Persian food. It's outstanding. And that got me very interested. And so I just kind of pursued the study of the language, which also got me interested in, first a little bit in the politics, but then I realized that the politics needed deep historical context to make sense. And so now I'm a historian. I mean, I'm a social historian of the 19th century. And I'm interested in the ways that people interacted in the everyday, across languages and across groups. And that inspires me and that motivates me. That's why I'm into this. So, anyway, thank you for two excellent questions.
Thank you, Alex. I have a question, but if my brother here does not have the same question, I will let him go first.
Oh, I can do with that. Thank you, Eric. Lovely talk. I'd like to make a couple of observations,
Please.
if you'll allow me. And some of them have to do with Melissa's question and the gentleman's question on the Sunnis and so on. First of all, the reaction of Turkey or Pakistan has nothing to do with being Sunni. Iran is Shia and still very concerned. So it's not a Sunni Shia issue at all as far as the Uyghurs are concerned. The second one is your comment on China and Melissa's own comment on 26 ethnic minorities and so on. We mustn't forget that China's been associated with Islam since the 8th century. And it's an 8th century mosque in China. And there hasn't been a problem about Islamophobia as such until recently. And the roots of it are very interesting. I've been watching the Uyghurs for 30 years now. And I came in touch with them when I went up the Karakoram Highway into China and right at the border in 83 or 84. And I think it's interesting, most people don't realize it, that at that time, Xinjiang was totally isolated from the world. And you're right, the Han Chinese and the Chinese government did consider a certain amount of equality. In 86, Zia Haq, the president of Pakistan, who'd taken on the Russians in Afghanistan, persuaded the Chinese to let the Uyghurs come into Pakistan and go for the pilgrimages to Mecca. And they would be treated as Pakistani citizens and given the same facilities for the Hajj, and use rupees and heavily discounted airfares. And this is the first time since 49, certainly, that Uyghurs were able to go out and see the world. And I met them, thousands of them. They were fascinated. They arrived in Islamabad and Lahore at these airports, and they were fascinated by what they saw. And people rushed out to them and embraced them. This was the height of, if you wish, this new belief in Muslims taking on Russia and the quantum of Muslim ethnicities that are fighting in Afghanistan. And I think that's where this issue began. Because in 88, after the Soviet Union pulled out, hordes of rightist fundamentalist Pakistanis entered Xinjiang. Were you aware of that?
You said hordes.
Hordes.
I'm not aware of that. I'm a little suspicious
Thousands.
of it.
Multi-thousands. all entering China for trade.
Well, for trade, certainly, yeah.
Oh, no, no,
I thought you said
no. Yeah,
it's
but
across the border. Yeah,
it's
sure.
supposedly trade, but actually, many of them had fought in Afghanistan.
Interesting.
And for them, Xinjiang was the next place to liberate. And it caught the Chinese government literally with its pants down. They complained to the Pakistanis. And the Pakistanis started enacting border control. There was no border. You could cross without any paperwork practically at that time, as I did. Mm-hmm. And this movement began at that time. And I think a certain amount of influence, infection took place in Xinjiang at that time. Shortly thereafter, the Chinese complained very strongly to the Pakistanis, and there was an attempt to clamp down on this. And since then, they've been trying to hold back much of the rightist Muslim influence going in. But the infection found root. This is my belief.
Okay.
I met many Uyghurs and Chinese delegations who came to Pakistan at that time to meet with me for investments in Pakistan and to work on opening up trade. And the only people who spoke English were the Uyghurs or Urdu, and they were brought by the Chinese as interpreters. And publicly, the Uyghur men would say openly that we are Chinese. We are strong Chinese. We love China, and they'd make a point of doing that, so there'd be no misinterpretation. I think what. Sorry, finish. Am I taking too long? Okay, so last point here was.
Did you have a question? That was.
No, I want to make an observation. My apologies.
Well, I didn't cut you off. So I want to respond to that. Thank you for that, in fact. So one of the things about doing this work and this advocacy is we're mostly historians put in this position recently. And I think a lot of the political scientists who work on this have not attended nearly enough to relationships between Xinjiang and Pakistan and North India, which I think are historically extremely important. And I genuinely appreciate your observations. Because I always thought that even after 2009, there's pretty free movement between Pakistan and southwestern Xinjiang for trade of all sorts. And I said, China claims that there are Pakistanis bringing in bad ideas. So are you letting Pakistanis in so freely? It seemed very ironic. What you're saying about conservative Pakistanis coming to Xinjiang in the 80s is new to me. It's interesting. I want to look into it more, and I would love to see material on it, because that has not been attended to nearly enough. In part, I think, because I don't think we've seen a clear result from that in terms of actual jihadist activity. So if people were coming in from Pakistan and they were relatively conservative or radical, we're not seeing a political movement come out of that. So that's really interesting. And I'd love to hear from you a source on the Iran thing too, because I didn't know that Iran has expressed concern. If it did, good, because normally Iran and China have pretty good relations. So anyway, thank you for the observations, genuinely. I took notes and I appreciate them.
Thank you, Alex. Extremely sobering presentation. Regardless of one's views on Donald Trump, he does seem to be one person that is really able to stand up to China. I know with the recent economic negotiations regarding the tariffs and the trade war, that China's human rights record was under a bit of pressure. But from what I've heard from recent news reports, the American administration has sort of taken off China's human rights record in regards to these recent negotiations. So my question is, to what extent do you feel it is important to advocate to or lobby specifically to the current United States administration on this issue, in specific regarding these trade talks in the prospective trade war? Thanks.
There's a lot to unpack there. There's a lot to unpack there. So one being that one thing I do hear consistently from the China community is that the guy they have handling China issues at state is pretty good at what he does. Even if the rest of the state might be falling apart, their China guy actually knows, relatively speaking, what he's doing. So there's some confidence there. If Trump is the right person to push that with the Chinese remains to be seen. It doesn't seem like the trade negotiations are actually going that well or are producing the desired results. I will say that I think it is, regardless, important to advocate for these things. In part because it's what Uyghurs want people to do. If Uyghurs in the diaspora want Americans to advocate to our government, to help on these issues, then I think that is what we should do. And they have some degree of faith in the politicians who've taken this up. Weirdly, it has been, globally, the Uyghur cause has for some reason mainly been a conservative cause. And this very weird thing, in Japan it's supported by the far right, because again, they're not pro-Uyghur, they're anti-China. In the US, it's often taken up by actually Marco Rubio, is one of the most vocal people on this, as part of the Congressional Executive Committee on China. But there remains to be seen, is this a pro-Uyghur thing, or is it an anti-China lever? Is it something that you can just do and say, pass a few non-binding resolutions to show that you're tough on China without actually threatening anything? I think it would behoove us to make it more of a bipartisan issue. If you have a favorite presidential candidate, please get in touch with them about this issue. Some have made statements on Tibet, but no one's taken up the Uyghur issue, as far as I know. So I do think this is important in our own politics. I think we have to also learn how to work beyond our own politics. One of the ways of doing that is to ensure that we do have connections in China, that we do make those interpersonal links, so that we can show as friendly critics that we're concerned about this one thing. In many ways, I think it's actually more effective than working through the US government, which can always be perceived as opportunistic and imperialistic.
Let's have a big hand for our distinguished speaker.